The Hollowed Ones. The field trip to the medical research facility was supposed to be routine, a break from the monotony of classrooms and textbooks. But as soon as they boarded the bus, Elliot felt a subtle wrongness, like the weight of unseen eyes following them, or the way the teacher spoke in hushed, hurried tones that seemed out of place. But from the moment they boarded the bus, a sense of unease seemed to hang in the air, an intangible foreboding that none of the students could shake. Even the teachers seemed tense, their eyes darting nervously, and Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Edgewood High students were oblivious to the creeping horror that awaited them, a grotesque series of events that would unravel their very sense of identity and bodily autonomy, transforming this ordinary trip into a nightmarish ordeal beyond anything they could have imagined. Elliot Harper stared out of the bus window, watching as familiar suburban streets gave way to cold, industrial scenery. Jamie, his closest friend, nudged him with a smirk. "Think we'll see anything freaky? Like some mutant lab mice or something?" Jamie joked, but there was an edge to his voice, perhaps a hint of nervous excitement, or maybe an unconscious recognition of what was to come. The facility was oppressively sterile. The floors were polished to a high shine, and the air carried an antiseptic bite that stung the nostrils. The students were guided through a series of glass-walled rooms, shown rows of cages containing mice and racks filled with colorful chemical vials. Something about the place felt wrong to Elliot, the blank faces of the researchers behind the glass, the way the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, the feeling of unseen eyes tracking their movements. Their final stop was a room filled with odd machinery, cages far too large for mice, medical restraints, and peculiar instruments with needles that seemed comically oversized. A researcher in a starched white lab coat spoke to the students, but Elliot could barely focus. A strange buzzing filled his ears, a pressure building at the base of his skull, creating a sense of creeping unease that refused to dissipate. As they left, each student was given a small metallic pin, supposedly a souvenir emblazoned with the facility's logo. Elliot pinned it on reluctantly, the metal feeling unnaturally cold against his chest. Jamie followed suit, though Elliot noticed how his friend's face seemed unusually pale, his eyes distant. That night, the nightmare began. Elliot awoke in the dead of night, his sheets drenched with sweat, his head pounding. The air in his room felt stifling, thick with a strange, metallic tang that made his throat tighten, like the taste of blood after biting down hard on his tongue. It was unsettling, as if the scent carried an unspoken warning of something terribly wrong. His limbs felt alien, heavy, awkward, as though his body had been replaced with a facsimile that refused to obey him. His muscles jerked and twisted, contorting in ways beyond his control. It was as if he were trapped, observing his own body from afar. The cool air against his damp skin only made the sensation more surreal. The room seemed alive, humming with an eerie static, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. The faint creaking of the wooden floorboards under his feet was distorted, echoing strangely, almost as if someone, or something, was mirroring his movements. He could smell something faintly rotten, a damp, earthy odor that made his stomach churn. His legs moved on their own, carrying him to the window. He looked out at the moonlit street below, where a strange chill seemed to hang in the air, everything bathed in an unnatural, pallid glow. The wind rustled through the trees, a sound almost like whispering voices, carrying secrets meant to remain hidden. There, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, was Jamie. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, mouth hanging open, eyes vacant, an empty husk. Elliot blinked, trying to clear his vision, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Jamie's limbs moved in sharp, mechanical motions, like a marionette jerked along by invisible strings. His head lolled to one side, eyes vacant, with an eerie glaze that made him look less than human. His joints bent at unnatural angles, the sharp contours of his elbows and knees jutting grotesquely as though his body was being twisted from the inside out. A chill swept over Elliot, a gut-wrenching sense of wrongness that twisted in his stomach. He knew, even then, that something horrible had begun. The next day, Edgewood High was different. Students moved with a sluggish, disjointed gait, their faces slack, eyes glassy and devoid of life. Elliot watched Jamie stumble down the hallway, his head twisting too far to glance at something behind him, a sickening crack emanating from his neck. It wasn't just Jamie, more and more students moved as if they were being dragged by some unseen force, their vacant eyes staring straight ahead. Some of them twitched uncontrollably, their fingers jerking as if straining against invisible bonds. Others muttered under their breath, whispered phrases that made no sense, their words dissolving into guttural sounds. The eerie uniformity of their behavior, punctuated by these small, disturbing details, deepened Elliot's sense of unease. Elliot tried to talk to Jamie, to get some response, but Jamie only stared through him, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his lips trembling as if struggling to remember how to form words. A dark bruise marred the base of his neck, spreading like a cancerous stain beneath his skin. Elliot felt nausea welling up in his gut as he watched Jamie's fingers spasm, bending backward at an unnatural angle before snapping back into place with an audible crack. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. Elliot began experiencing episodes of missing time, moments where his consciousness blinked out, and he would awaken in strange, disorienting places. He once found himself in the backyard in the dead of night, barefoot, the grass cold and wet beneath his feet, the wind biting against his skin. Fear clawed at his mind, a desperate confusion gnawed at him. Why was he here? What had brought him outside? He felt the disorienting mix of terror and helplessness, a primal urge to understand what was happening before it was too late. The trees swayed above him, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows under the moonlight. He could hear the distant rustle of leaves, a whispering that seemed almost alive, surrounding him. His hands were smeared with something dark and sticky, blood. The metallic scent clung to his skin, and he knew deep down he didn't want to find out whose blood it was. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like a distant static hum that could almost be ignored. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all Elliot could hear, drowning out his own thoughts. The whispers commanded him, urging him to inflict pain, to hurt others, to succumb to the darkness. He tried to fight back, tried to push the voices away, but they were inside him, burrowed deep, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, twisting them until he could no longer distinguish his own desires from their cruel commands. He saw it happening to the others too. He watched a girl in his class slam her head against her locker repeatedly, her eyes wide, vacant, her forehead splitting open with each sickening impact. Blood streamed down her face, splattering across the metal, but she didn't stop, as if something inside her demanded this relentless self-destruction. In the cafeteria, a boy gripped a fork and drove it into his own arm, again and again, his expression emotionless, his eyes empty. The students around him screamed, but the teachers did nothing, they simply stood there, their eyes glazed, their bodies rigid, like mannequins. There was something about their vacant expressions that seemed even more unsettling, as though they too were trapped, their will stripped away. Their bodies swayed slightly, their eyes following the chaos without recognition, as if they were under the same dark influence that controlled the students. The violence escalated quickly. Elliot stumbled into the bathroom one day to find another student hunched over the sink, clawing at his own skin. Thick chunks of flesh peeled away under his fingernails, revealing the sinew beneath, blood flowing freely, spattering the mirror and the white sink. Elliot's breath caught in his throat, his stomach twisting painfully. He wanted to scream, to do something, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his mind unable to process the scene before him. The boy's eyes were dull, as if he couldn't even feel the pain, his body nothing more than an empty vessel, devoid of any will. Elliot's heart pounded, 1,000 thoughts crashing through his head. Why wasn't anyone helping? Why couldn't he move? He felt a wave of dizziness, the metallic scent of blood overwhelming his senses. He swallowed hard, the bile rising in his throat, tears stinging his eyes. The world seemed to narrow, the edges of his vision blurring. He had to get out, but his body refused to obey. The worst of it was Jamie. Elliot found him one night under the flickering lights of the football field, his body convulsing, his arms bending backward at grotesque angles, the bones snapping with wet, nauseating cracks. Elliot ran towards him, heart pounding, but he quickly realized Jamie wasn't alone. The field was full, dozens of students and teachers stood there, their bodies contorted, limbs twisting in impossible ways, their heads jerking from side to side as though pulled by invisible strings, mouths opening and closing in unison, the whispers spilling out in a droning, dissonant chant. Elliot. Jamie's voice was faint, barely audible, his eyes meeting Elliot's, tears streaming down his face. It won't stop. I can't make it stop. His voice broke into a sob, his body seizing violently, his spine arching, the bones pressing against his skin as though they were about to tear through. Elliot reached out, but before his fingers could touch Jamie, a violent jolt ran through his own body, his muscles locking, his arms twisting behind his back, the pain sharp and all-consuming. Elliot felt it then, the parasite, the presence that had infested him, controlling his movements, taking away his agency. It wasn't just in his head, it was in his blood, his bones, gnawing at his insides, feeding off his fear and anguish. He could feel flashes of his former life slipping away, his mother's smile, the warmth of sunlight during summer breaks, the laughter he shared with Jamie before everything had turned dark. It was like watching memories being swallowed by a black void, each one snuffed out until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He tried to fight it, to cling to those images, but they were being ripped from him, leaving only the cold, creeping sense of emptiness. His hands trembled, his body no longer his own, and with every breath, Elliot knew he was losing himself, piece by piece, to the thing inside. He looked at Jamie, saw the hopelessness in his eyes, and realized that there was no saving any of them. The students began to move in unison, their limbs jerking, their bodies convulsing. Elliot's legs carried him forward, his movements no longer his own. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the whispers, his mouth opening wide in a silent howl of despair. He could see the others, one boy collapsing to the ground, his skull shattering with a sickening crunch, blood pooling beneath his broken body. Another student's arm twisted until the bone snapped, splintering through the flesh, the white of the bone glistening against the crimson. The field had become a grotesque theater of suffering, an unholy dance choreographed by an unseen, malevolent force. Elliot watched as Jamie's body began to fold in on itself, his bones breaking, his flesh tearing, his face twisted in agony, mouth stretched wide in a final, silent scream. Elliot felt his own jaw unhinge, stretching unnaturally wide, his bones creaking under the strain. His vision blurred, spots of darkness dancing across his sight, and he felt the searing pain radiate from his jaw down through his neck and chest. He could hear the grotesque symphony of flesh tearing, bones snapping, echoing all around him, but it seemed distant, almost as if he were watching from somewhere far away, detached from his own body. Jamie's scream cut through the night, silent and yet deafening, his body collapsing inward like a crumbling marionette. All around him, students were falling, their bodies convulsing, limbs twisting and contorting as the whispers surged to a crescendo. It wasn't just whispers now, it was a guttural chant, reverberating through the earth itself, vibrating through Elliot's bones until he thought they might shatter. He felt something wet running down his neck, blood, or maybe something darker, something that shouldn't have been part of him. The field was a tapestry of writhing bodies, blood pooling on the grass, glistening in the moonlight. Faces twisted in agony, mouths stretched into rictus grins, their teeth breaking as their jaws snapped open, and fingers clawed at the earth as if trying to escape a fate already sealed. Elliot felt his consciousness slipping, his memories being stripped away layer by layer until only the raw fear remained, primal and endless. His legs moved against his will, stepping over Jamie's body, his feet splashing in the slick, crimson-soaked grass. He could see his classmates now, their faces no longer recognizable, skin hanging in tattered strips, eyes bulging from their sockets as they gaped at the night sky, mouths open wide in desperate, choking gasps. The smell was overpowering, the coppery stench of blood mingling with the putrid odor of torn flesh and bile. The whispers turned into screams, horrific, guttural screams that filled the night, echoing off the empty school walls. It was no longer just inside Elliot's head, it was everywhere, a symphony of despair that reverberated through his entire being. He felt the thing inside him, felt it writhe and pulse, like something alive, something feeding. His head snapped backward, his eyes staring up at the dark sky, tears streaming down his face. He knew he was losing, that he was already lost. The final image seared into Elliot's mind before the darkness closed in was Jamie's broken body, his hollow eyes staring into nothingness, lips moving as if to say something, maybe a plea for help, maybe a farewell. Elliot saw Jamie's mouth begin to move, forming words that could never be spoken, the horror etched into his friend's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. The realization twisted inside Elliot like a knife, their humanity was being hollowed out, scraped away until nothing remained but raw fear and pain. The last shred of Elliot's sanity fractured, and he fell forward, his face hitting the wet grass, his teeth crunching against the soil, the taste of blood filling his mouth as darkness smothered his consciousness. The field quieted, but the horror remained, a macabre stillness that filled the air like a scream that refused to fade. The bodies lay twisted in grotesque positions, eyes wide, staring into the abyss, their mouths frozen in twisted, silent agony. The silence that followed was almost worse than the screams, a suffocating void that seemed to drain the life out of everything it touched. Slowly, the lights of the school flickered, the dark settling over Edgewood High like a suffocating shroud, a final acknowledgement that what happened here was beyond salvation. The earth itself seemed to reject the horrors that lay upon it, the grass tainted with blood, with pieces of flesh and bone, a tapestry of torment painted across the landscape. In the distance, the faint rustling of leaves sounded like whispers, whispers that promised this was far from over. The parasite had taken hold, and it would not stop. It would spread its roots deeper, from one person to the next, from one generation to the next, until every last vestige of humanity had been stripped away, leaving nothing but hollow shells, bodies forever trapped in a silent scream, and empty whispers echoing eternally in the darkness.